Joining us live today is Professor Sean Valles from MSU's Center for Bioethics and Social Justice. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started with specific questions about the IVF situation in Alabama, can you explain your background, bioethics? It sounds complicated.
So my background is in history and philosophy of science and in medical ethics and public health ethics. And so my research focuses on how do the policies that we make, either in the healthcare world or even things that don't seem like they're part of healthcare, how do they affect people's health? Things like if we change taxes, we change how we do policing or incarceration, things like that.
Sure. So this decision by Alabama Supreme Court just issued last week. We're already seeing some domino effects. Based on your research, how might this affect public health and people going through these treatments or who would like to?
The most dire thing I'm really worried about is that I think this will actually basically increase the gaps between the haves and the have-nots in terms of access to reproductive health care. And so as this new ruling makes it more difficult to actually carry out any kind of in vitro fertilization health care, it's going to make the costs go up, it's going to make the options go down. We already saw that there are two clinics that have already at least temporarily shuttered their operations. It's already a fantastically expensive process, and so as we make it more difficult, it's going to be harder and harder for families that are experiencing infertility to basically try to pursue expanding their families.
Sure. So for people who are looking to expand their family, what sorts of steps should they take, seeing that this is now in place?
We're in the very, very early days of this. I think the reason we're seeing pauses as opposed to complete closings of clinics is because everyone's kind of going around scrambling, trying to figure out what exactly does this mean in Alabama. The extent of the ruling is only for Alabama, and so this has not formally reached anywhere outside of Alabama. But what it's doing is continuing a trend that had been established even before the Dobbs decision essentially ended Roe v. Wade, which was the strategy of what's called TRAP, Targeted Restrictions of Abortion Providers, which is basically to pass laws and to appoint judges that would support those to make it extremely difficult to run any kind of clinic that provides abortion services. Things like requiring certain building permits, requiring relationships with hospitals that really had no purpose for healthcare, but it was really to try to make it harder. And that was the express purpose, but it was always kind of kept under the surface. And so what we're seeing now is IVF clinics are sort of coming under fire as there's this new set of possible restrictions that will be put on, and so they're trying to figure out, is someone going to decide tomorrow that my freezer is going to qualify as an unlicensed childcare clinic because there are technically children in there who are all the size of roughly a grain of salt.
Yeah, I know you're not a doctor, so we don't want to ask you too specific questions about the procedure, but you already mentioned this is already an extremely expensive set of treatments. People wipe out their life savings on this.
Yes.
Many people already cannot afford it. And it's not a guarantee. Is the goal not to get as many embryos as possible? So wouldn't everyone be affected by this if they're going through these treatments?
So typically, so a complete cycle of in vitro fertilization starts with basically doing injections or medication to stimulate egg production, going in and actually removing some of the eggs, and then in vitro means in glass, and so mixing together the egg and the sperm outside of the body instead of inside the body. But when you do that process, you can't just pluck out one egg and one sperm. You have to have more than one, typically with eggs that you'll end up with roughly 3 fertilized ones, and then sometimes they'll do extra testing for genetic diseases, for instance, if either of the people providing the material was a carrier of a genetic disease. And so you don't have just one shot at this, and often when they do an implantation, it doesn't take. And so they want to reduce the number of cycles you have to go through, each one being on the order of $20,000, maybe partially covered by medical insurance, maybe not. And so it's extremely expensive and it's costly, and there are side effects to the medications trying to stimulate egg production, and so it is very burdensome to go through this process. And so anything that makes it harder, it's already an incredibly difficult thing, and let alone emotionally as well.
Yeah, it is. And I'd imagine that there's a lot of people there who are going to try to fight this process. Where do you see the argument going from here?
Well, I'm curious to see if it'll follow roughly some of the same trajectory that happened in Italy. So there was an effort in the early 2000s, or around 2003, 2004, in Italy to try to basically have a similar set of restrictions on in vitro fertilization based on a lot of the same sort of rationales. For instance, restricting the number of embryos that could be created and requiring that all of them be implanted, as opposed to having some of them stay inside the freezer. Eventually, they walked back most of those because there were human rights objections saying, is this burdensome to women in particular? Is this going to be unfair to people who have medical needs? Is this creating enough leeway for people with genetic diseases to still have children? And so they sort of gradually brought those back, although I'm wondering if we're going to sort of see the same trajectory of making a very broad ruling that's supposed to be for a narrow case, but it has huge implications, not really thinking through any of those implications and then saying, oh, that was a terrible idea, and then maybe sort of taking it back. I hope that some of this will be walked back a little bit because this was not fully thought through, and this was a few judges making a decision that's going to have huge implications that they never really actually dealt with.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of ripple effects ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned. Different medical systems across the country, doctors themselves fearing prosecution.
Exactly.
What are the downstream effects of that when the medical providers themselves are not able to lead with what they think is the right move or what they've been trained to do?
Well, as someone who's working inside a medical college, so the College of Human Medicine at MSU, and I worry for my colleagues if they want to go or for my students who want to go to practice in a place that's going to have these kinds of policies or attitudes. But what's really going to happen is people will decide, I'm not going to go into reproductive medicine, or I'm not going to go into it in Alabama, and so not set up shop, close up shop, make it harder for the people of Alabama to get access, and then if other states decide to follow suit, it will make it harder for their families too.
And this is already a rather small, very specialized field, right?
It is, and so it's essentially just making it so difficult. Again, these targeted restrictions and trying to make it unlivable to work in this area. And then people will just decide not to. They'll decide to go into some other area, and it's very sad because in some sense it's almost the inverse of what happened with the end of Roe v. Wade, which essentially required that a lot of people who wanted to not continue a pregnancy, saying that no, you have to continue that pregnancy. This is sort of the opposite. This is saying that lots of families that desperately want to have a child now will have a much harder time having one.
Interested to know what kind of conversations are your students having about this situation right now?
Distress is the main thing I've seen. A lot of despair, saying, how can I practice medicine doing this kind of thing? I've only talked to a few students about it since the decision, talking to colleagues as well, saying, how could we possibly be doing this? This seems like such a step backwards. It is not a ridiculous thing to think that life begins at conception, but to classify, again, embryos that are around the size of a grain of salt as children there are consequences to that ruling that have not really been thought through, and it's not going to work out well.
The Alabama State Senate Health Care Committee may introduce a bill that could protect IVF in the state by clarifying that embryos are not viable until they are actually implanted. Do you think that's one direction or one way this may be sidestepped? It's possible they could sidestep it, but even the fear that this will continue a trend, I think, is going to drive people out of the field. It's going to dissuade people from pursuing this as patients. And so even this is sort of a test case in a certain sense, but even sort of flying up that test balloon to sort of see what the reactions are, it's going to make it harder in the future. And so the damage is already done just by seeing that this is a thing that's even a possibility, because it's a radical move. Yeah, there has been some damage done. Do you see any kind of compromise in this as they try to continue with the conversations? Realistically, I'm not especially optimistic about the room for compromise right now. I think trying to open up more discussion around this is going to be really important. In the sort of the contemporary American abortion debates, in vitro fertilization has largely stayed outside of the conversation. We talk a lot about abortion, but not a lot about selected reduction of implanted embryos, which also involves having a fertilized embryo that is no longer going to become a child, and so it's going to be interesting seeing what happens to the conversation now that in vitro fertilization and fertility clinics are now directly inside the conversation instead of on the periphery. There are a lot of people that have used these services, and a lot of people who want to in the future, and so. I hope that they think about what they want out of their health care and what they want out of their policies and lawmakers, and to vote accordingly. Well, we very much appreciate your time and your expertise today. Professor Sean Valles, thanks so much for being here. Thank you again for having me. Appreciate it.